All right, well, thank you. We just concluded our organizational caucus meeting for the House Republicans. I am honored to have received a unanimous election as the leader of the caucus and really to continue as leader of the caucus. We feel that we've had a successful last 4 years, lowering Minnesotans' taxes and lowering healthcare costs in the state of Minnesota, funding education with some great reforms, doing some really good things that we know will help Minnesotans. We know that the economy is doing great in Minnesota, and we know it's because of those policies. We're going to have a big surplus in November, probably an even bigger surplus come the February forecast, and we're going to roll up our sleeves and really talk to Minnesotans about the things that we know are important to them and what we need to prioritize here during the next session. We're also going to hold Democrats accountable. They made some promises on the campaign trail that we don't think they can keep. They talked about lowering health care costs, but their ideas will actually increase health care costs in the state of Minnesota. Some of their ideas will have devastating impacts on hospitals and clinics in rural Minnesota, and a lot of their ideas will reduce the quality and coverage for a lot of Minnesotans that rely on their health care. So we're going to hold them accountable, but we're ready to roll up our sleeves and really work on solving the problems that Minnesotans care about. So with that, I can take some questions.
Do you see any similarities between this challenge ahead and the last time you were minority leader, or are you a different lawmaker at this point? Or?
Well, I said to somebody I should probably go back and watch the video from 6 years ago when I did this press conference, because I was literally a freshman right at the end of my freshman term getting elected to lead one of the caucuses. And I have grown personally and professionally quite a bit in the last 6 years. I know a lot more about how things work around here. I consider myself to be a very effective leader, a very effective negotiator, but I'm also somebody who has a heart and really wants to roll up my sleeves and solve the problems that Minnesotans care about. I will put that before politics every day of the week, because really we're all here to help Minnesotans and make sure we solve some of those problems. And there are some big problems that face Minnesotans. I think most Minnesotans in this last election cycle, probably as much as half of Minnesotans that voted, would say that healthcare costs are their #1 concern. And we have concerns about the plans, or in some cases lack thereof, that the Democrats talked about during this election cycle. We know what will work and what won't work. The last time that Democrats were in charge of Minnesotans' health care, they put a plan forth that raised the cost of insurance premiums by 300% in this state. And now Minnesotans have elected people who ran and campaigned on lowering health care costs. We will join Minnesotans. We will join those voters who were promised that their health care costs were going to be lowered. We will join them in holding these new members accountable. But we're willing to roll up our sleeves and be part of the solution.
The governor-elect and the House Democrats have both talked in the last day about doing gun control, gun safety bills, universal background checks, domestic protective orders were two things mentioned by the governor-elect yesterday. Where do you stand on those things?
We obviously want to make sure that we're keeping Minnesotans safe. That was our #1 priority. We know that the practice in Minnesota is that background checks do happen. They do happen on almost every gun transaction. The ones that they don't happen on, we likely know that it would be very difficult to even control that. I'm talking about a transaction between family members or that sort of thing. We're happy to have those conversations. My members are the rural ones now. We're the members who frankly are engaged in that rich tradition of hunting and gun ownership out in rural Minnesota, and we want to make sure that we protect the rights of Minnesotans to continue to participate in that rich tradition. But our priority is to keep Minnesotans safe. We're going to participate in the conversation.
Is there a gun safety bill that you would support? Is there something the legislature needs to do?
At this point, I'll wait until those proposals come forward to give any comments. There aren't any specific proposals before us now, but I think we all share the priority of making sure we keep Minnesotans safe. And we want to keep guns out of the hands of people who are potentially dangerous criminals. Everybody can agree with that. So let's figure out how to do that.
In addition to healthcare, Speaker-designate Portman said that, especially in those suburban districts where you lost a lot of members, gun safety, gun laws were a big topic of conversation. Does that concern you at all?
Not necessarily. We certainly share the thought that we want to keep Minnesotans safe. There's no question about that. In the practicality of how you do that is a much more difficult conversation, right? There was a lot of generalities made about transactions at gun shows. It doesn't matter whether you buy a gun at a gun show or in a gun store, you have to have a background check. If there's a way that we can increase background checks, so the practice of background checks, and I'm talking about private party now. Remember, private parties don't sell guns at gun shows. I'm probably one of a handful of members of the legislature that's ever been at a gun show. If you're buying a gun at a gun show, you have to have a background check, right? The only time they don't happen is between family members for the most part. I don't think someone in this state who does not know the purchaser would, or I don't even think they should, transfer that without a background check. But every gun transaction in the state of Minnesota has the ability to have a background check right now, and we think that's a great practice. So we want to engage in that conversation.
Have you spoken with House Democrats about their priorities and your priorities, what you might be willing to agree on?
Not yet. It's always kind of an interesting time frame right after an election. We weren't expecting the result that we got the other night. We knew that we had a little bit of a headwind or a gale force headwind in the suburbs. We knew that, but we also knew we had incredibly high quality candidates like Jen Loon. I just didn't believe, given Jen Loon's past record of winning with 62% of the vote and outperforming the top of the ticket by 10 points, that people in her district would not re-elect her this time. And I can talk about some of the polling that we saw. When we were, people did not vote against Jen Loon, and they didn't vote for her opponent. We could see that in the polling. They literally were voting against Washington, D.C. And that's a really tough thing for us, because we're really proud of the stuff that we accomplished in the last 2 years. And I know that. I mean, I have the polling data and the facts behind that. I mean, there was one time when we polled Jennifer Loon's district where she had 75% name ID or more. I think 80% name ID. She had almost 3-to-1 people that had a favorable opinion versus unfavorable, and she was tied on the ballot 42-42 against an opponent that only had 13% name ID, right? That literally means, if you extrapolate those numbers, that people that had a favorable opinion of her were voting against her, and they didn't even have a clue who her opponent was or what her opponent stood for. So that's a tough thing for us, because we do take pride in what we do, and we're proud of our accomplishments. And there's probably no member of this caucus that's more widely respected or liked by both sides of the aisle, or more effective than Jennifer Loon. And so some of these losses, we believe are far out of our control and beyond our ability to impact that. And I think for that reason, it makes them even more difficult to swallow. So we had to take some time to, kind of absorb that. And, we had a dinner last night where we let our retiring members kind of say goodbye. And this morning we had a reorganizing caucus. And I'm not officially the leader of the caucus until we have this caucus meeting this morning. So I will reach out. I'm obviously still the Speaker of the House, and will be until the next one is sworn in. I still have some duties to take care of, but I'm going to make sure we have a smooth transition and help the other side get their house in order, and we will sit down and talk about priorities. I did make a phone call last night to Governor-elect Walz and just to congratulate him. I assume my number's not programmed in his phone yet, so he didn't answer, but I left him a message, and I assume I'll hear back from him today. We likely will, at least I will invite him to sit down for breakfast or lunch sometime in the next week, and we can talk a little bit about priorities and how we can work together. I've heard that he's a good person to work with. I'm concerned about some of his ideas and some of the promises made on the campaign trail. We're going to talk about that. We've got some big problems to solve in the state that we've been working on already for, 2, 4, 6 years that he's just picking up on now, and he needs to take the mantle in helping us solve those problems. So we're going to have those conversations, and I look forward to working with him.
Are you hoping some of your defeated members run again in 2020?
We haven't really even talked or thought about that, but I'll tell you, I'm really proud of the members that we have had in our caucus, and really proud of the work that they accomplished. And it'll be interesting to see if the folks that replaced them are really living up to the expectations of the district, and if they can live up to the promises that they've made in their districts. And if they don't, we're going to hold them accountable. And I have a feeling that some of our members don't feel like it was. They feel like it was beyond their control that they lost. They feel like it was issues from Washington, D.C. that impacted that. And my guess is they may want to run again. So we'll see.
So it sounds like, as you kind of digest Tuesday, that there wasn't necessarily a message from voters about what House Republicans need to do moving forward or what they need to change or different priorities, just that this was kind of a national election that swept out otherwise unpopular members. Or popular members, excuse me.
I'm from working with me for a few years now that I am very much into the data and the politics and the the election side of things, and this is a tough one. It's tough to understand. It's tough to comprehend. I don't think voters were sending us a message personally, other than we don't like what's going on in Washington D.C. right now, and that makes it difficult. I guess on one hand, they didn't tell us they didn't like what we did for the last 2 years. I think if we were to poll that and ask voters, hey, what do you think of the tax relief that we gave you? What do you think of the lowering of healthcare costs 2 years in a row? I think we'd have a resounding level of support from them. They didn't care. They didn't want to hear about it. They didn't even care what we had done. It wasn't about us at all. It literally was about Washington, D.C. And the reality of this election, if I could sum it up one way, I would say that in the suburbs 2 years ago, there's a fairly decent amount of the electorate that voted for Hillary Clinton for president in the suburbs and then voted for a Republican for the legislature. This year, those people saw our president as a Republican, and they voted against all of us as a way of sending a message to D.C. And that's tough for us to take because we don't have a lot to do with what goes on in D.C. But frankly, I think we will regroup, and we're going to continue to talk to Minnesotans about the issues they care about. We think that our members connect much better in the suburbs and do a better job of representing the suburbs, but we'll make that case over the next 2 years.
How much more help do you need from the top of the ticket, and what's the way to stem this the pretty horrible losses in the suburbs among Republican statewide candidates over the last decade and change?
I think the top of the ticket. Our president didn't help our top of the ticket here, and Jeff Johnson running for governor embraced Donald Trump and did that somewhat vocally, and that could have even hurt us. Now our members outperformed our top of the ticket, Jeff Johnson, by an average. Just the seats that we lost, they outperformed Jeff Johnson by an average of 4 percentage points, and some of them individually as high as 7 or 8 percentage points in their district. It's if somebody would have asked me 2 weeks ago, if your candidate, is it possible for your candidate to outperform the top of the ticket by 7 or 8 points and still lose, I would have said there's no chance. But that's the reality, and there's only so much of that you can overcome.
Do you have to change your messaging as House Republicans over the next 2 years, or is that not your responsibility?
We don't think so, because we don't believe it was our record or our message that lost this election. And we know that our message resonates with voters much better than what the Democrats. In fact, the evidence of that is very clear. If you look at the promises that Democrats made in this election, they were promising the things that we actually did, the things that we actually accomplished. Those were the things they ran on. Now the interesting part is going to be, do they live up to those promises they made, or do they tack far left? I'm suspicious that they won't live up to those promises they made to their voters, that they are going to tack far left, and we will be there to side with Minnesotans to hold them accountable if they don't live up to those promises.
With a divided legislature and a new governor, do you see any way that a tax conformity bill could be done in time?
We could pass a tax conformity bill in the first month that we're back in session. Shouldn't be a problem at all. The problem is going to be that I don't believe or trust that Democrats can pass a tax conformity bill that doesn't massively increase taxes in this state. And I'll be watching very closely and intently on what the November forecast says to see how much revenue. We're really proud of our record over the last couple of years, because we've put in place some tax relief and some economic growth and that's because of our policies that frankly will create a pretty sizable surplus for the state of Minnesota. And when we see that surplus, we all know this because we've seen it so many times, and they're already talking about it. I've already heard Governor Walz talking about raising the gas tax. Why? We already have a surplus. We're already taking in more money than we need. There's no reason to take more money from Minnesotans when you already have too much. And that's the problem. Their default is always to take more money out of Minnesotans' pockets and more money out of the economy.
On the gas tax and some other contentious issues, is your message to Senate Republicans be the stop? It's up to them, isn't it?
It is. You know, we're going to be the voice of reason over here in the House, and we know that our colleagues are, our colleagues over in the Senate have the same opinion that we do. We're going to side with Minnesotans. We're going to side with Minnesotans' pocketbooks, and this is a pretty common sense, easy thing, right? Let's say we have $1 billion surplus in the November forecast, which is likely. And that surplus, by the way, will be in the current biennium. We're not even talking about the next one. The next biennium had a surplus of $450 million in the last forecast. I think that could be, it wouldn't surprise me if it was $1.5 billion or $2 billion. I mean, that forecast was calling for 2.3% economic growth, something like that. We're at 4.4% economic growth, right? I mean, if the forecasts recognize the real economic growth and the real potential for the revenue that should be coming into the state of Minnesota, we could have a $1.5 billion or $2 billion surplus in the next biennium. Anybody whose first reaction is to raise taxes when we have a $2 billion surplus needs to get themselves checked into an institution. We're taking in more money than we need. That's what a surplus is. It's time to invest that money back into Minnesotans. Let's grow the economy. Let's get more people making more money, and they will eventually then pay more income taxes at a lower rate into the state of Minnesota. There's two ways to create revenue for the state. One of them is economic growth, and one is by extracting it out of the taxpayers by raising rates and creating new taxes. One of those is works and is sustainable, and one of them is not. And I think you know which one's which. All right. Thank you all.